the students, we don't want to be a dependent state. We don't want to be a state that's being looked at by other states as continuing to draw down and not contribute. And so we first and foremost, we absolutely should pursue as much socioeconomic independence as possible. Once we do that, I think the political status question should be answered by the people. And once we do that, I think the people will be able to answer that question from a position of strength. Now, with respect to what my people want back on Guam, 70% of them at this time, based on polls, they want statehood. But I'm not quite sure if it's statehood because they believe that incorporating the United States in that way is what they truly want, or if that's a position that they want to take because they have less confidence in our ability to self-govern as an independent state. And that's why the question of political status really should be a question that is asked after we have achieved as much socioeconomic independence as possible, because you want to be answering that from a position of strength, so the political future is based on a very, very strong foundation.
One of the main issues in Puerto Rico, of course, is the debate now about statehood, but what we don't know if it's viable, if the United States one day will accept Puerto Rico as a state. Do you think that Guam will be accepted as a state, and how important will be in that debate the population of Guam, the fiscal situation of Guam, that are issues that are always debated in the U.S., and we are seeing that debate right now regarding Washington, D.C.?
Well, constitutionally, I mean, Guam will not be able to pursue statehood because of our population limitations. Those are realities that we have to face, and perhaps in the future, those kind of realities can change. But I do know that the people of Guam at this juncture would prefer statehood as a political status option. Even if they were to hold a plebiscite, binding or non-binding, and the vote were to be statehood, however, I just do not see the United States actually granting that based on the population constraints that are currently in place.
And how important is the identity debate? The identity debate, you were talking about the debate that have going on in Guam initially about who should vote, if only the Chamorro people. How important for them is the identity? And I will add another question that I always ask people in the U.S. and in Puerto Rico too. If I met you in Europe and I don't know you, and I ask you where you're from, what would be your response?
I'm from Guam.
That's the same answer that probably 99% of Puerto Ricans in the island will give you. But if you meet a U.S. citizen from Utah or from Florida, maybe they will say, I am an American, I'm a U.S. citizen. Why those differences?
Actually, if you run into a Texan, he'll tell you he's from Texas. I think that identity in terms of regionality, there's passions that ebb and flow. And I say that I'm from Guam because I'm passionately from Guam. But it isn't because I choose not to identify as an American. And so, those kind of circumstances, I think, depend entirely on who it is that you're speaking to, the context upon which that question is being asked. Like if someone were to ask me where I'm from in Europe, I'll tell them I'm from Guam because I would absolutely love to tell a European all about my island, versus I'm from America and don't ask me about, geography or whatever because I might get it wrong. But, so it really depends on the context of the conversation. But I don't think that that there is necessarily an identity sellout or a refusal of the American identity by choosing one answer or the other. I think that you can be as much proud to be from Guam as you can be proud to be an American.
There is the debate, and there are two cases right now, in the Supreme Court that maybe, can discuss the issue of the insular cases. And people that propose getting away from the jurisprudence of the insular cases, they have a point. It's a very discriminatory jurisprudence. It's unfair. It's undemocratic. But what do you think the U.S. will do if one day the Supreme Court decides, you have to make a decision, Congress? You have to declare these territories, incorporate territories that usually suppose that they are on their way to statehood, or dispose of the territories. What do you think will happen with Guam?
I think that is one of the most important questions that we need to be asking ourselves today. because I very much agree, and I think that the rest of the country will agree, if they really understood the context of the insular cases, they were very much racially based. They were racially based, they were control based, they were based on all the things that America absolutely today would reject if these insular cases were being brought before our courts here and now, as a brand new case. That being said, the real question of what happens next, I think, is what's really causing everything to lock up. What do you do if these cases really were racially based, and if classifying these areas and the people within these areas is something that needs to be overturned? What does happen next? And I think that those are the kind of conversations that we need to be having, and I think that these kind of forums are a great way for us to be able to begin that kind of engagement, because when that changes, because I very much agree with what Kenneth said, it's going to change. When that changes, what does happen next? And I also agree with what he said about how the Congress has a tendency to operate most effectively under a crisis. It might be the overturning of those cases that immediately begin the Congress's responses and reactions. What that's going to be is difficult to predict, but we definitely need to be engaged in the dialogue.
When we were thinking that Delegate Plaskett could come to the conference, I interviewed her probably 3 weeks ago, and I asked her almost the same question, but I added another one. What happens if the option is, we are going to grant Puerto Rico statehood, and Virgin Island, you can be part of Puerto Rico? And she said, no way. Why? Because the culture, because the different identities. So I will ask you the same question. What happens if they tell you, well, you can be part of Hawaii?
I think that kind of extrapolation makes for very good dialogue, but I don't think that it's very, very pragmatic in terms of political realities. When it comes to finding a solution, when that question finally comes to the point where we need to answer it, I don't think that we're going to be putting our territories in that kind of a position. I think that what we will have a difficult time trying to figure out is if we are going to be extending the right to vote, exactly how is that going to be extended? If we are going to be extending it in terms of House representation, is there going to be Senate representation? Are they going to be able to vote for president through an electoral college representative? Those are the questions that are going to need to be answered when those insular cases are overturned. But I don't think that they're going to try to destroy the territorial integrity of the various insular areas. I just do not see that happening.
Yeah. It's very interesting because the Delegate Plaskett is supporting status for Puerto Rico, and I told her, well, maybe half of the population of Puerto Rico will agree with you regarding their relation with the U.S. In one of the reports of the GAO regarding the fiscal situation of the territories after Promesa, they mentioned that they were afraid that there were some risk with the pensions liability in Guam. Can you tell us, how Promesa has changed the fiscal debate in Guam, and if there are some fears that at some point Guam can face the same restrictions and decisions regarding a fiscal control board or austerity measures that will be required by Congress, like telling them, maybe you are close to be under the jurisdiction of Promesa.
I don't think Promesa changed those realities. I think that the defaulting on the debt changed those realities. I think that what happened as a result of Puerto Rico's debt crisis has impacted territories in their ability to be able to access capital markets, in the scrutiny that investors now have on our capital ratios, our ability to service our debt, and our debt ceiling with respect to what we're capable of borrowing. I'm not quite sure if a similar circumstance in the future will result in a Promesa type of outcome in other territories. I would like to hope that all the challenges that Promesa has presented to Puerto Rico has created, at the very least, in the smallest of silver linings, a learning experience of the Congress, to understand that doing things like this does not actually result in the kind of solutions that we're looking for. If I was in Congress, one of the things that I probably would have proposed would have been to actually just convert all of the Puerto Rican debt into U.S. treasuries, and then that way you just completely wipe it out, and then you implement a new system so that going forward, they don't get into that same kind of problem. Because the reality is that Puerto Rico's debt crisis was not born out of entirely Puerto Rico's irresponsibility. It had to do with investors, and it had to do with investment houses willing to take advantage of the triple tax exempt attractiveness of territorial debt and rack up the fees as much as possible to float it, while politicians, of course, are more than willing to take the money. That makes for a very, very bad formula, but I don't think that it necessarily makes for a very, very bad state of affairs. I think what that does tell us is we need to make sure that we're not having those kinds of relationships that are going to result in that kind of spiraling outcome. And so Guam going forward, and that's actually been one of the big platforms that I ran on when I ran for senator in my local legislature, because my government at the time was borrowing money to pay for tax refunds, basically taking out 30-year long-term debt to pay for immediate deficit spending. And I was against that, and I ran for office. When I first decided to run for office, my slogan was, "Let's build a responsible Guam," because I was telling our people we cannot be borrowing for operations. Doing that is going to sink your finances, and we're going to suffer for all those years that we take on that debt. And when I first ran, the community, they were receptive, but a lot of the political experts told me that I wasn't going to win. They said that a political platform like that would not resonate with the community. It's going to go above their heads, and you're not going to be able to get the votes. And long story short, I came in number 5 in that election. And I used that as a mandate throughout the rest of my political career to be able to speak truth to our people about what the actual numbers are telling us. Because at the end of the day, no matter how good you are politically, you're never going to beat math. And so that's been our philosophy going into office. It's been how we've conducted ourselves since then. And it's why I was able to develop a reputation with my people that when I say something, it might not be the most politically popular, but it is the truth. And that's, I think, a very critical component in the context of self-determination. Because if we're going to tell our people that we're going to pursue this political status, they need to trust us. They need to know that when we're going to go in that direction, we're going to deliver on the outcomes. And so that's why we have a responsibility. Puerto Rico has a responsibility. Guam has a responsibility to our people, that if we're going to lead them down a path, they need to trust that we're going to achieve with it.
Let's go for a couple more questions before bringing Delegate Underwood, former resident commissioner in Colorado. Delegate Underwood was talking a little bit about the proposal that a lot of people may remember in Puerto Rico that the Popular Democratic Party has made since Muñoz Marin and more recently during the debate of 1989 to 1991 with Governor Hernández Colón, is to add a delegate to the Senate. You submitted a bill about that in December. Tell us about why you are proposing that and what are your expectations that that bill can move forward.
Well, it just comes from a very pragmatic point of view, and that is that, you know, as a member of Congress, I mean, I'm a non-voting delegate. I can still introduce legislation. I can still kind of usher it through committee. But even if I'm able to get something passed in the House, once it goes to the Senate, there's no territorial voice to even advocate for it. I mean, even just the ability to advocate has so much power in terms of being able to speak to members who you develop a relationship with and who trust what you have to say. Just recently, I had my Guam Chamber of Commerce come out and make their rounds of members of Congress along with me to try and advocate for certain things that they're interested in with respect to federal legislation. And in the meetings, we'll talk with the members of Congress and we'll share with them what the concerns are. And a lot of them say, you know what, Michael, you know, you do such a good job here. You're an excellent representative. If this is something that you want to advocate for, we're going to do it. The details, I mean, of course, the details would matter to a certain extent, but just being able to have the voice and be in the room and have the relationship already opens up so many doors. And so if we want territories to begin to move incrementally towards that achievement of self-determination, we at least need to be able to sit down at the table. And so when I introduced that bill for non-voting delegates to the Senate, some of the advisement I got was, you know, you're sending the wrong message. You're saying that it's okay to be a territory and you're okay with non-voting and you should never do those things. You'd always just fight for the right to vote. And I sat back and I said, if we want to be purists, we can do what we've done over the last 30 years. And we're going to continue to do that for the next 30 years. And we can say we're purists 30 years after that. Or we can start sitting down at the table and begin making incremental progress so that we can start notching that belt so that my son won't be 30 years old having the same conversation.
There had been a debate about war reparations. I know that you submitted a bill trying to make technical correction to the law that allowed to give some money. I believe it was, I don't have the detail here, but it was around 10,000 to 25,000 to every Chamorro people because of the Second World War. Can you explain that process? Because interesting, Delegate Plaskett also mentioned that, they are still debating that regarding, the transfer of power between Denmark and the U.S.
Well, the war claims issue is actually a historical issue. Every delegate since we've had delegates has pursued it. Dr. Underwood, actually, he was the author of the main step that got this going in his final year in Congress, where he got the War Claims Commission established to be able to review this. And so basically this goes back to World War II. The Japanese, of course, occupied Guam. Guam was a U.S. territory, and the Chamorro people, who were under the protection of the United States at the time, suffered tremendous atrocities, forced marches, rapes, murders, beheadings. And when the United States forgave Japan at the end of World War II of all their obligations, they also just so happened to forgive them of the obligation to make right the war crimes they committed on Guam. And so for decades, for many, many years, my predecessors have been doing a lot of hard work to try and have the United States own up to that obligation, since it abdicated Japan from that obligation, absolved Japan from that obligation. And so my immediate predecessor, had language inserted into legislation that allowed for claims to be adjudicated and for money to be set aside. But that language did not have the necessary words for the Treasury to actually be able to cut the checks. And so I introduced the legislation to be able to do that, and hopefully we're going to be getting that passed soon.
Okay. Let me do a final question regarding status before bringing the other panelists. Do you think that Promesa changed forever the possibility of trying to reform the territorial status under the territorial clause and show the territories that, if you are really serious about resolving this issue, you have to think out of the territorial clause?
I think it was definitely an opportunity for that conversation to occur with all eyes on the issue. I think that Promesa was really, when I look at it, it definitely doesn't look like a work of any kind of genius. It looks like some kind of effort to try and address a circumstance that had a lot of interested parties that also just so happened to impact a lot of affected people. And I definitely don't think that it was anywhere near a perfect outcome. Whether or not that was a lost opportunity for us to really capture the conversation and talk about the greater question of territorial status, I think that it definitely was an opportunity. But I think that the ongoing challenges of Promesa have actually allowed us to continue bringing that conversation up. That's one thing that I do when I'm in committee and Promesa comes up as a conversation. I always bring up that the activities of Promesa and its heavy imposition on the ability for Puerto Rico to be able to manage itself is actually undermining the very intent of why we're trying to make sure that the territories are able to stand up on their own. And so while it may have been we may have been able to capture that opportunity better back then, I think that the ongoing challenges of Promesa do provide us with an ongoing opportunity to keep the conversation going.
Do the right to vote for the President of the United States will resolve the undemocratic relation with the United States?
I think it's one very, very small step. It's important, but I think there's a lot of historical grievances. There's a lot of inequities, and I think that we need to resolve all of them in order for us to truly be equal.
Do you see the presidential candidates during the primaries there? I know that Guam will have a primary, I believe, in May the 2nd. Do you see them? Do they send anyone to campaign in Guam?
They do. They always have their own little, their own little offices to just try and rally the troops. But, I really, and this is something that I sit back and I look for. I want to see one of these candidates actually talk about territories, because then I'll know that you're actually looking at the whole country. The fact that none of these candidates Democrat or Republican, speak about the territories when they're running for office just shows me that they're not looking at the whole country. And I think the whole country should wake up and realize that if your candidate for president isn't talking about territories, then if we're that much out of mind and we're one of the components of this country, then how important is any other rural community in America truly outside of the campaign trail?
Okay. This is just a curious question. Did you see advertisement from Michael Bloomberg?
No, I didn't, but you know, I mean, it's a little late for
so
that.
he was not campaigning already in Guam.
I have not seen anything on Guam.
Okay, okay. Let's bring Delegate Underwood and Resident Commissioner Colorado, if we can, to continue this conversation. I would like to start with Delegate Underwood. How much the debate has changed since you left Congress in 2003, and what will be the impact, you believe, for the long run of Promesa?
Are you asking specifically about Promesa?
Well, what will be the impact in the long run for the territories of Promesa? And, you know, because you left Congress, if I'm not wrong, in
2003, right.
If you have seen any change regarding policies?
Well, I think Promesa is probably a very sobering piece of legislation because it could apply to the other small territories. And so but more significantly, it also kind of exposes the kind of nature of the federal territorial relation, that at any point in time the federal government can come in and do something to a territory that it would not ordinarily consider for a state. And so that's a very disruptive reminder of the exact nature of your relationship to Washington, D.C. And it doesn't simply apply to that, it also applies to individual agencies inside local governments, third-party arrangements, all these things that are sometimes court-ordered, and they apply inside the states, but they seem to happen more frequently with territories. And they also, you don't have the political clout because of your scale. You don't have the political clout to deal with it. So I would say that Promesa is somewhat of a lesson learned, but I think the lesson is not just about getting your fiscal house in order. It's more like understanding that the nature of the federal territorial relationship is imbalanced and very unequal.
Almost same question for you, Mr. Colorado. You were a member of Congress for almost 1 year in 1992, but you were before that the Secretary of State, Economic Development Administrator. How things have changed since you left government, and I would like to add to that debate the pursuit of tax incentives from the government of the Popular Democratic Party. Do you think that type of proposals are over, that we are not going to really see any more huge tax incentive to try to stimulate the economy in Puerto Rico?
Well, let's look at it from the perspective of what we can do as islands, you know, outside of the main territorial mainland of the United States. When we talk about tax benefits, and I think it's important that one of the issues that we discuss here not be limited to status. You know, we've been talking about status all the time since we started. I think there are many other things where we can work together, and one of them is economic development. With the tools that we have today, not that the tools that we may have later on. economic development has to occur now. We have to do it now, especially in Puerto Rico, where because of the changes in government every 4 years, we are where we are, and because of the laws of 936, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, I believe that we need an equalizer. Being islands far away from the mainland, you cannot compete on a fair level ground. It doesn't exist. So basically, we have to work on the basis that we need something to equalize our competitiveness with the mainland. Basically, what we have used in Puerto Rico is tax benefits. And it makes a lot of sense, and many other countries use it. For example, take the Dominican Republic. We grant 96% tax exemption. The Dominican Republic grants 100% tax exemption. And we say, okay, they are doing better than we are. Yes, well, that's one of the reasons. They have 170,000 employees in manufacturers. We used to have that, and we've lost more than half because of these changes every 4 years. So I think it is important that we talk about status. I think it's very important that we relate to each other, because from what I have seen today, just in a few hours, the issues are the same. The issues in status are basically, okay, participation, trying to benefit from the relationship, but each one is saying at the same time, we have a different culture, and we want to maintain it.
Talking about that debate, Jeff Farrow mentioned, and he's right, everybody recognizes that Congress can impose any requirement that they want about language, and the state can change it, one day after being a state. But maybe that's not the real debate. Maybe the debate is, if the U.S. how much can the U.S. can wait to really being convinced that the reality of the territory regarding language, they can accept it.
No, wait. The United States can do much more than that. The reality is it does it with many independent countries. So we know that the United States has gotten into a country and has taken out the government and whatever. Yeah, so those things can happen.
But I mean, do you think that they will offer statehood to Puerto Rico with the common language as Spanish, with the official language in schools, in courts, in governmental office?
I don't know, but it would be stupid if they do. Because really, the United States doesn't need 3 million more Americans. They need 3 million more people. I mean, if we ever become a state, that would help the United States, help the rest of the United States. And the territories, because of their culture, they have more value than if they didn't have that culture. Being American somewhere else, I don't think would help the nation as much as being what we are. So, but I believe that that's what I've seen also as an issue from all of the different territories, and I think it's important. And these are the type of things that we may have to discuss among ourselves and realize that we are not so far away from being exactly, having the same issues.
When Resident Commissioner Pierluisi, and this question is for the three of you, when Pedro Pierluisi was a Resident Commissioner, one of his statehood bills or status bill was submitted. I remember that now Chairman Grijalba was one of the co-sponsors of the bill. And I approached to him one day in the hall, and I asked him, why you are supporting that bill? This is considered a statehood bill. I said, no, I'm not supporting statehood. I'm, letting the Resident Commissioner start that debate. And my question is, how much important is that solidarity between colleagues when you approach the Puerto Rican status debate? And, I mean, for the delegates San Nicolas and delegate
For me, I always try and make it a point to follow the lead of my colleague. And so if my colleague is pushing for legislation that is going to result in statehood for Puerto Rico, then I'm going to assume that the Puerto Rican people elected my colleague, and so I'm going to follow the lead of my colleague. And so that's pretty much how I operate with respect to those kind of issues that are very, very unique to an area. Members of Congress, we will weigh in when something is going to spill into the greater question. But when it comes to political status questions, I cannot assume to know better than my colleague who is representing the people that elected that individual.
I think there's the principle of mutual respect and non-interference. I think that's more operating than simply just saying that we're good friends and that we've come to an understanding. I think people want to, if something is really important to a fellow member of a committee or a fellow member of the House, you simply say, well, I'm not going to get that much involved in it, no matter how I personally feel about it. And that usually happens across the board. But I'll share one story where it didn't happen. And that is when we were talking, there was a member of the House who was very interested in direct election of the president. And he was going around asking people constantly to sign a petition and for a law to have a direct election of the president. And this individual was from West Virginia. So I said, oh, well, that's great. I said, that's great. That means now that people in the territories will be able to participate in the election of the president. He said, no, let me think about that a little bit. And let me think about that a little bit. And so after that, he never talked to me about it again. So, you know, you can take, and this was an individual I got along with very well. So you can take personal relationships with someone a long ways, but sometimes when you think they kind of run into your bailiwick or your orientation, they sometimes slam the door on your face. And so that's also another lesson. But I think that there's a general rule of non-interference. I think that's just mutual respect.
Yeah, no, I obviously, being being from Puerto Rico, I understand, and that is usual, that, the other members or the other delegates will back whatever that delegate from the territory is asking for. As far as I'm concerned, obviously Puerto Rico has to decide what Puerto Rico wants and then ask for it. I believe that, different from what Jeffrey Farrow said a few hours ago, I believe, and nobody can convince me otherwise, that if you can give 0 or you can give 100, you can give anything in between. I cannot see how Congress can give you nothing or can give you everything and cannot give you something else. That's not understandable. I don't think that there could be a clause, the territorial clause, and to interpret it in that way. So I believe Puerto Rico has to decide what they want, and some people may call it one thing and they may call it other, and that's what we should ask for.
There was a question from the public, Jose Garriga Picot, that maybe, is for you. For a long time, pro-Commonwealth leaders alleged that the Constitution of Puerto Rico could not be unilaterally amended by Congress. Then, has PROMESA amounted to unilaterally imposed change in status and a denial of the right to self-determination?
I think it did. I think it shouldn't have been that way, but it did, yeah.
Okay. And how close we are, you think, to a resolution of the status? And I know that, in the territories, they feel that we are that big sibling in the middle.
Well, I remember...
With the PROMESA law, maybe not only the next elected governor, maybe the one that would be elected. Let me stop to recognize the arrival of President Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez.
Well,
maybe, we are not only electing, or Puerto Rico is not only electing in November a governor that for 4 years will have PROMESA and the fiscal board. Maybe the governor that Puerto Rico elect in 2024 will still be under the jurisdiction of the PROMESA. So, are we going to see a resolution soon?
My personal, the way I think could be wrong, but like the grandmother used to say, ooh. I don't see it now.
Well, welcome, President Commissioner. We have been talking about different issues during the last 45 minutes, but I believe how much time we'll have? 10, 15 more minutes? Well, they will stop me. 15 minutes, okay. First question that I asked Delegate San Nicolas was, what is the state of the relation with the U.S. government? And, you know, we know the difficulties with the Trump administration. How you respond to that question?
Well, there are going to be many issues. First of all, sorry, I was in another forum, and I want to say thank you and welcome to San Nicolas for coming to the island. He's been a great ally and friend, not just in the committee in the House, but in many of the other issues. The territories are together fighting Medicaid, fighting many issues regarding energy as well, and he's been there. And I really thank you for that, even with the recovery process. So in that sense, territories are aligned, and I don't know if it's the first time, because I was not there when Tito was there and many others, but we do have regular meetings to discuss our bills, and we actually divide the areas of interest to support each other in the House and in the Senate. So in that sense, as we are all facing kind of the same challenges, we can see it in the economic development of each territory, with the jobs in each territory, with the healthcare provisions in each territory. We are doing that in a common ground. The second part of your question was how things are going with the administration. There are several areas that need improvement, but I will say that this is the first time ever we got the kind of allocation of funds, not just CDBG funds, federal funds in many federal programs to the island that are the highest amount ever. Of course, we also got the first hurricane of this magnitude ever on the island, and the current tremors and earthquakes. So it will, I think, to go to in a nutshell, I think the recent position of the federal coordinator from the White House, Admiral Brown, I think that was something that I've been asking for the last 3 years, because sometimes even when the law provides for specific resources to the island, the bureaucracy of the process going to OMB, Housing, FEMA, Homeland, and many other federal agencies are making the island to go slow in the disbursement of funds. So having one person now with the proper power to make those calls, and actually we are seeing some of those things happening and flowing right now with the current last agreement of $8.2 billion, how we can draw down the funds in the recovery process, how we can expedite those funds is the other area. And regarding Promesa, and I was hearing something about Promesa, there was supposed to be a markup during the next weeks regarding the draft bill of the chairman of the committee. And I think we can discuss the draft bill, but if there's no commitment to seating majority and minority and having bipartisan support, even in basic stuff, nothing is going to happen.
Do they have your support?
Some of the issues of the bill, I will tell you one. We can name a few of them, but for example, the McCloskey thing, the ethics provision about the contractors with the oversight board, that's something that got bipartisan support. That's the bill of Nidia Velázquez. We support that part. I think that should go without any problems. We need to revise the definitions on many other provisions about essential services, the debt process as well. So if we want to have something done, getting something done, it should not just be a bill in the House. It should be a bipartisan support. And at this time, there's no meetings regarding a proper discussion of this draft bill with the majority and minority.
We were discussing the status issue, as you can imagine, and
No,
you know,
not kidding.
the new Progressive Party.
Like Tito say, woo!
Well, he was saying that because he believes it's going to take a long time. But your party is legislating a new referendum, and you know the main goal of the bill that you submitted in October and that Delegates and Nicolas is supporting is to have the support, the validation of the Justice Department. Can you talk a little bit about how that process is going?
Yes. First of all, we need to remember that a few years ago, Congressman Serrano allowed the disposition of $2.5 million to do a plebiscite on the island. And in that sense, it was a direct instruction to the Department of Justice, allowing the government of Puerto Rico to legislate having a local referendum with the options that were validated by the Department of State using the recommendations that different White House, Obama, Clinton, and Bush White Houses recommended. And we're talking about statehood, independence, and independence in association with the United States that were the only valid options at the time. I know that locally we may disagree, and people may disagree with that, but those are the only legal options available to the Department of Justice. So we can go to the 2017 process, but right now the Department of Justice is actually revising the language of the 2019 Budget Act that instructed the Department of Justice to work with the government of Puerto Rico, specifically with the Elections Commission, to work to the process of how are going to be the ballots. If we're going to be using $2.5 million for federal support in that sense. So the bill that is going to be approved in the House next week, and it's supposed to be signed by the governor, would allow that process to go with the local federal elections commission to work with the DOJ in terms of the process. And that's the reason we're using the same ballots that were used in Hawaii, the same ballots that were used in Alaska. So there's no new definition, there's no new process, exactly the same thing. Why? Because we want to have the same kind of process those territories that were later on accepted as a state used. So I don't see why the Department of Justice may not endorse or disperse the funds. I actually think that's going to happen. But that shouldn't, at the same time, compromise or prohibit the government of Puerto Rico from doing so. If we're using the same ballot, the same models, the same way other territories did, we should do it anyway, with or without the consent of the DOJ.
Okay, last question, because I know that we have to close this panel. Since November of 2018, the New Progressive Party adopted that idea because Chairman Bishop at that time told and wrote the Justice Department, the former Governor Rosselló, and you telling them to the legislators, the president of the Senate and the House in Puerto Rico, telling them, the 2017 referendum was discredited because they didn't have the certification of the Justice Department. You should do a yes or no vote about statehood. Why that legislation was not approved last year? If you are in a rush, why wait until November of 2020? And second, is this the last referendum? And what will happen if the support is not 97, is not 61, and maybe it's 51, if or less? We don't know.
First, this is not an issue about a rush. This is an issue of getting the people of Puerto Rico to select what's going to be their future. And in that sense, in 2017, the people who were against, of the 97% of the people who vote for statehood, of course, are the people in the opposition that will always complain and will always say that the process was not fair or whatever reason. Actually, the main reason they're using now is that there was not enough voters in that electoral process. So that's the reason we're promoting to have the referendum in conjunction with elections. So there's going to be no excuse to having the same ballots where you're voting for the governor or the rest of the positions locally and having more participation in the process. We should not be afraid of people voting. We should be actually promoting that for happening. In the second sense, you asked for the letter of 2018. I was in that letter. I was working with that. And the time to approve the bill, it could be last year. Everybody know what happened here in August of last year. So this is the time to do it. The Legislative Assembly got the power to do so before June 30. So I think we are running in time. with enough time to do the education process. That is one of the requirements of the federal government and the local government, and we will have it with the election. So we've been talking about having this referendum, yes or no, since 2018. And second, I think more people going, and I don't care about the percentage. It's about people voting and people expressing what they want. I'm totally sure that we're going to win that again. People of Puerto Rico.
Is this the last one?
I hope so. I hope so.
Okay.
I hope so. If I got the numbers of the lotto, I will play them. So it is not about if the federal government says that is enough. That is enough. It should be enough. It should be enough. We've been counting the sentiment of Puerto Rico for many years. The ball is not in our court. The ball is in the court of Congress. And without Congress acting and allowing Puerto Rico to become a state, that will continue to happen. But I know that it's going to happen. When? The question is when. And that's what we're working for.
Okay, thank you to everybody. Thank you to Delegate Michael San Nicolas, former Resident Commissioner Antonio Colorado, former Delegate Robert Underwood, and Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez. And thank you to the Biblioteca Jesus de Piñero. Gracias.
Thank you to the panelists. Now we are closing the morning session. We will have a lunch break until 2 o'clock when we will start our afternoon session. For the benefit of the audience, taking into account the short time period for the break, the university has several alternative food establishments with reasonable prices within the premises. In the atrium, just outside the auditorium, you will find information about them and a map to effectively locate them within campus. Meanwhile, the panelists, the moderators, and the guests of the university and the Piñero Center, that is, those that have red and blue IDs, those that have red and blue IDs will be meeting during the break at the restaurant of the International School of Hospitality and Culinary Arts, better known as ISHCA, for a lunch with the Vice President and the Chancellor of the institution. We will be gathering just outside here at the atrium. Remember that you can pay for the parking ticket in advance in the campus central aisle. The cost is a fixed fee of $1. Also during the break, our sponsor, Microjuries, a legal research firm, will be holding a discussion table, reacting to the panels and presentations of the morning session. They will be at the Piñero Gallery. That's a room in the first floor by one of the building entrances. Buen provecho, and see you at 2.